Well, I can't sleep right now, so I might as well make a recording. I have been contending with a lot of thoughts and considerations on Plato and what seem to be the at least modern inheritors of some of Plato's attitudes and philosophical treatment of, well, I want to say fudged philosophical treatment of political matters. And actually it's not, I would, yeah, it's hard to sort of directly name and title the kind of the ideological species and the ideological sort of bundle uh, into a neat character and sort of anyway. This comes also after having heard a lecture on Stoicism. Um, anyway, so I've got a lot of these thoughts buzzing around, but let me get to something more concrete. Um, although I did just want to uh, make reference to the idea that I'm going to, at some point, be culminating these ideas, hopefully, into a thesis that carries some weight with it and that is able to be useful, and perhaps even break some new ground on some of these matters. So, I know a lot of these themes I think are generally understood, um, at least by people who contest identity politics and the ideology uh, that looms within the social justice mantras and slogans and this weird interpretation of equality and social justice. Now, I just want to point out that, I mean, as sort of as scary and as uh, strange as these cultural times are, um, that I just want to draw people's attention. You could say the seed of this idea was probably planted by Sargon of Akkad when he did his video responding to three arrows. Um, but the point that I'm making now is sort of is maybe in slightly thematically in league with some of his themes, but it doesn't really amount to that. But I think that we live in a time now where I think almost in every culture, uh, people who are thinking on matters and these cultural matters appropriately can start to consider ourselves in at least some slight sympathy with the modern German consciousness of their hideous past and history as, I would say, the same intellectual spectre uh, that manifested as a full outbreak in Nazi Germany has culturally re-emerged in modern times. Uh, and it exists in in the robes and the vestments of intellectual authority. You know, the smart people, the so-called intellectuals, are the main proponents of this form of illiberal doublespeak. You know, this rationalization and formulaic approach to making progress with this, tremendous uh, impetus to exteriorize and sort of objectify or consolidate the enemy into an identifiable, workable, rational program that just needs to be doubled down on and not backed away from, or something like that. That they've got this sort of this rationalization which they're not going to let go of. And the reason why I'm bringing this up on a kind of meta narrative scale, or at least on the scale of a kind of collective narrative, is just to illustrate the point that what the real problem is people's judgment itself. And I mean that in a generalized sense, but I'm going to get specific in that there are elements in every population. There are personalities which are naturally occurring within humanity, and some of these personalities, they have inclinations, they have styles of how they process information. And it just so happens that there is a certain league of these people which, in some sense, because they don't have an independent sense of intellectual integrity, they by necessity have to band together. They have to create authority structures. They have to create prestige economies in which their investments, or at least their returns on their investments into that prestige economy, keeps on providing dividends and returns and can't be deprived. So it's a way of having an ulterior cartel and racket that is capable of ensuring a kind of self-promotion. Now, the arc of the tactics that have to be kind of collectively reified and fortified and given a kind of cultural currency of dignity, eventually will have its toxic manifestation. And inasmuch as that the general culture is not able to identify and root out the cause of this, because of essentially an institutional impediment of a kind of opaque defensiveness, which essentially will manifest as a kind of as a residue that builds up, that is not capable of being challenged, and that just keeps on eventually building a kind of momentum as it's functioning, instead of being challenged and substituted. Doesn't have the acuity to allow the core tenet of its erroneous thinking questioned, because it's too much to expect it to sacrifice the whole beast, the whole program. It needs to just redirect the program to continue in some more sophisticated and convoluted strategy. And this is generally the form in which much of academia has been ideologically captured. which what it's hard to discern, but you can see is essentially the same drama playing itself out on in different realms of intellectual discourse. The drama in the use of subtext and the almost the social manipulation, um, and the kind of and the this kind of universal idealistic uh, rationalism, which everyone has a kind of is woven into in some sort of linear correlation, so that there so that some level of confidence can be invested into when the fudged solutions, or the fudging of life by this formulaic ideological process uh, is being collectively orchestrated. Okay, well, so I mean, the problem is that it's very hard to pin down this stuff, because if you challenge it, well, first of all, in some sense, you're not allowed to challenge it. Um, Fundamentally, at the outset, you don't get a ticket to the show. It has insulated itself, so that any disruption to it is by its internal description uh, uh, a priori it's invalid. Yeah, I would say that the really the best depiction of what is going on can be seen in what I believe is the fantasy elaboration of Nazi philosophy, and the fantasy description of the mechanics of Nazi philosophy in the Lord of the Rings. And just sort of understanding the themes of the Lord of the Rings, or at least my interpretation of those themes, I think you can start to see uh, how culture is being consumed um, by the re-emergence of the same cultural phenomena of the progressivism that swept pretty much all of the Western world. I mean, people forget how Hitler was the most popular leader in the Western world before the war. Uh, the kind of promise of liberation that he offered his, and people always, well, I don't know how this sort of flies by the radar, but fascism has always promoted itself in the clothing and the branding of the left. Fascism has never not promoted itself as a left wing uh, project. It has always branded itself as socialism. It has always said that that is what it's trying to do, is to do socialism. Uh, I guess one of the problems in the nutshell is you see how the system is trying to reproduce its own cultural dependencies, um, or reproduce what it needs in order to ideologically revive itself and replenish uh, its own sufficiency in terms of what it's offering to people. And so, you see students being conditioned to be disintegrated human beings in the same way that you have Gollum and Smeagol, who historically, when he first saw uh, the ring of power, uh, he killed his fellow uh, journeyman, you know, to jealously, sort of have it for himself. Um, the simplicity of being the single bearer. Um, so they had a fight, and well, Gollum or Smeagol later deceives or not, or this is also self-deception. He when he admits to hobbits or whatever that it was just an accident. It wasn't murder. That is the first story that it's just an accident. I guess the fellow journeyman in this analogy would be something like uh, other entities, or other things that aren't me, things that aren't yourself, things that inform another perspective, or are an independent, separate source of lived experience, rather than just the um, so this notion is basically destroyed right at the start, and you sort of have this new being that has to sort of have killed its fellow journeyman. It is now this kind of new being of a kind of dualism within itself. It has these two sides, Smeagol and Gollum. And what has it done? Is this an accident inherited from history, or is this murder? Uh, and it tells others that it was not murder, it was only an accident. That the One Ring appeared and caused this. Now, the ring itself is, or the Ring of Power, is the one ring to rule them all. And there were other rings made which somewhat are meant to define and characterize the delimited dimensions of all the beings, the necessary qualia that make up definitive uh, characteristics that people are sort of fated. So it's part of a structure. It's the pinnacle at the top of a power structure that everything can eventually be reduced into power, and therefore there is one way in which this thing goes. There's one way in which this thing can be computed and uh, monitored in order to deliver judgments that are unquestionable, a certainty that cannot be argued with, that it can only be pervasively or collectively channeled and plugged into. So you have this universal rationalism, you have this universal idealism, which is sort of by default, you're either in conformity or you're in inconformity. Um, again, this has a lot to do with a fundamental distrust which is projected onto other fellow travelers, that there's a real sort of dehumanization, and I mean that in the humanist sense of the word, um, that other people can't actually bring fundamentally dignified uh, uh, things, to the table. That the table itself, uh, things might be placed on them which are novel, but the table itself can only support so much, and that already is sort of defined by a kind of something that is essentially amenable to some kind of zero sum bargaining. That there's only one form of bargaining in which um, that should take place, or that is supported. So they might not know. There might be unknown quantities of what you're dealing with, but how you deal with it, there's only one way that it is at least eventually reducible to power alone. Even as in different magisteria of the different rings, they might have their own uh, separate but almost fundamentally, so it's this weird paradox of separate but equal, is sort of woven into it. But then there's this meeting ground of the one ring, which is essentially something like the one table. And it's interesting that the one power that the ring has is the power of invisibility, the hidden hand, the hidden influence within the system, the sort of uh, the thing, the unseen thing that binds them all, that has to be wielded, but it cannot be. It's invisible. It has this moral untouchability. Now, this moral untouchability is really exemplified by Smeagol, by Smeagol and Gollum's fracture, disintegration. And you can see this in how students are being conditioned with safe space culture, essentially. I mean, the idea of safe space is that the intellectual subtext of a safe space is that everyone has to know and agree in the same moral knowledge, in some sense, that there is a single narrative about what is true, and that has all these exploitative implications, and it's really based on an exploitative zero sum game, because that's the only way that you can give someone the freedom to be so emotionally vulnerable, is that there has to be a huge amount of unquestionable certainty in order to just maintain and or in order to preserve and facilitate even the notion of a safe space. So it's interesting that there is the subtext of don't be exploitative, because otherwise you're disrupting the safe space. And so there's this very solid certain sense of what it would mean and what it would be to disrupt. So there's this very definitive way in which exploitation has a very definite intellectual implication, which is effectively then never spoken of. That's merely the subtext, and the subtext must remain unquestioned. That is what makes it a safe space. And students are not allowed to, in a sense, integrate any intellectual defense of that, because even to speak on an intellectual defense of that would mean to allow some sense of vulnerability. And so the only vulnerability that is allowed in some sense is the questing for everyone's assent and deliverance of an exterior source of self-esteem. And in as much as that it's not meant to be seen as providing that self-esteem, but in establishing it. And so everything is in a process of unbecoming. It establishing. It's an adjective, and then it becomes the rule of an adjective morality that no longer has principles but has moral codes, codes of conduct, speech codes, wrong think, essentially, because the thinking that is not allowed is the challenge, the intellectual challenge of the intellectual subtext that underpins the safe space. And so this is why the whole movement is based on insulation. That could have been elaborated probably slightly better. And so, ironically, there is a very definitive sense about what is morally inferior, how to tell what is morally inferior conduct in the safe space. And you see that the implication of that code has an intellectual expression. It could be expressed. I mean, it somewhat isn't expressed. It's only ever expressed as a negative. Almost an exemplar illustration of this would be anti-fascist. So they will describe their principle by a mere label of what not to do / be. So they've, instead of actually having a principle in an a priori framework of how to work out the substance of something, instead the only evidence that is taken is this kind of moral majority, that this idea that, well, okay, this really has to do with how fudging works. That it's weird because it ends up having, the problem with fudging essentially is that fudging is even a bit hard to even describe intellectually, because well, it is actually a wonderful way of describing it, but you have to understand it properly, in that the thing that is doing the fudging is the solution, and the issue that it is treating becomes fudge. It turns into fudge, and so it does have a kind of it does end up creating a weird kind of codependency. So the thing is that they've got a model of a solution. They've got a way of making it right, but there is there's no intellectual substance in that tells them that the problem has been solved. That is answered by some feeling or something like that, and that is actually the problem that is being fudged. And so there's a weird codependency between the intellectual subtext and the cultivated vulnerability and disintegration of of a student's pure feelings, with no intellectual component voiced. So it's sort of, it's either voiced in a stark dichotomy. It's either the sort of this pure vulnerability, or this violent and radical defense of some kind of infringement that is happening. um, and again, you can see this in the sort of the stark guilt and innocence. Oh, it was just an accident. Oh, it was murder. um, Again, this is really exemplified by the Smeagol golem. um, okay. And so essentially, because the intellectual subtext is such a vast problem that is in the process of being fudged anyway, that the solution will never be able to fully address the grievance, at least not right away. So it's done in such a meager fashion that it can't be spoken of, because it's so raw. It's like a wound, that has not even begun to start healing. So you have this sort of radical sensitivity born about it. Um, Therefore, it cannot even be mentioned. You have to almost create this strange bubble of the, which is meant to be itself proof of a collective commitment to this program, which will eventually have to have a political champion, or consume more and more administrative powers to itself, eventually getting into the wielding of power and the mediation of power and the filtering of power according to some kind of pervasive one-size-fits-all lowest common denominator program of apportioning token blame and guilt for the entire narrative. And this is the biggest dehumanizing problem of it, is that people have to buy into the tokenism, otherwise it just doesn't work. And so the explosion of racialist consciousness and the embracing of racialist consciousness, this is what Hitler called this is who Hitler called his useful idiots. The huge progressive movement that held hands with Nazis as they had their Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches, because they were dissatisfied that their politicians were not rendering justice unto the identity. Because why be involved in politics? Why hold your government accountable? Why hold politicians accountable when the challenge is just so great, and it's sort of everything is just a slow march, that it's sort of, it's not even close to, you need a kind of a new kind of radical politics, that really is capable of divvying out this collective justice. Now, we do have a problem in this country with the secondary legislation which has betrayed the Constitution, specifically the Equality Act. Let me just, I wrote it down somewhere else. I'm going to have to. Now, the Equality Act was obviously written by someone with a very toxic ideology and a very deep hatred for the structure of the South African Constitution, and also the content of the South African Constitution. it's completely inconsistent with the spirit and the form of the Constitution. Um, it very badly maims, and it has actually caused, it has been the root of corruption in this country. The root of it has been the moral ruination of the South African, of the new South Africa. Um, and this really has to do with, well, I can go into it conceptually and then also talk about how this has essentially given politicians an endless loophole and a way of scapegoating and a way also of, specifically, it's given them tools to perform corruption above board. Uh, uh, I shouldn't actually try to do this from memory. Let me just quickly get the. Okay, so the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. Which, I mean, that really actually sums up in a nutshell, that actually, I might have to get back to this to fully get into it, but that actually shows the you see, it doesn't in an obvious way, but that is why it has failed the Constitution, is because it has not been faithful to a very important distinction that was made in Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. Where it talks about the powers that government has and that the legislature has to promote or advance, to protect or advance disadvantaged persons. Now, protecting or advancing disadvantaged persons, it says disadvantaged. That means people that have already been disadvantaged. And it doesn't say previously disadvantaged, it just says disadvantaged persons. This belongs, this right, and this subsection of Section 9, Section 9 subsection 2 of the Bill of Rights. Now, unfair discrimination is not something that just belongs to apartheid. And it does not, and this act does not say historical. It does not say historically unfair discrimination. That notion, that phrase, historically disadvantaged persons, that comes only in the promotion of equality and prevention of unfair discrimination. Now, just to get into sort of the legal reasoning, I'm just going to title it here as the bottom line. But basically, you're not allowed to promote equality and prevent unfair discrimination at the same time. You have to do one or the other. And by doing the one and not the other, you are indirectly doing both. But when you try to do both at the same time in the same thing directly, that's a contradiction. Now, yeah, and that comes out more clearly in the more simple wording of protecting and advancing. You cannot protect and advance at the same time. You can essentially, uh, I mean, in some vague sense, if you're protecting, you're indirectly advancing in some very vague, tenuous sense. Anyway, um, so you can really see that, like, well, if you at least if you will at least go along with my thesis to think about it for a while and to try it out, you'll see that you can see how things start to get convoluted. That essentially what is happening is the promotion of equality is now going to substitute for advancing persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination is going to be called the promotion of equality, and protecting uh, persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination is sort of going to be substituted by the prevention of unfair discrimination, which, has a whole array of strange ideological baggage and layers of mediation. So essentially, okay, I don't have the text for it. I just have my notes, which is probably not the best way to do this. But basically, the real problem is, um, in order to prevent unfair discrimination, which is somewhat conflated with patterns of disadvantage that are inherited from the past, it becomes fair to discriminate. What would otherwise be unfair discrimination becomes fair for another group of people. And so you basically have the logic of two wrongs make a right, essentially, woven into this very convoluted thesis, which is promulgated by the promotion of equality and prevention of unfair discrimination, where the Constitution says very clearly to protect or advance. If you could do both at the same time, why wouldn't it say to protect and advance? The Constitution does not say to protect and advance, it says to protect or advance. And so effectively, what then government has done through its legislation, it has instead taken this duty that it has in terms of Section 9 of the Bill of Rights, that it was given, the obligation that the Constitution puts on the government. Government has then burdened private citizens with its special right given to it by the Bill of Rights, or its special duty. It has given that duty to the people themselves in order to effectively redefine by plenary fiat unfair discrimination as fair. When essentially all the Constitution was doing was basically saying that government could set up programs, measures, budgetary interventions in terms of making provision exclusively for categories of persons and persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. That it could take positive measures in benefiting certain people that would not uh, uh, be subject to claims by the public that those measures were by omission invalidating their equality before the law. That was all Section 9, subsection 2 is doing. It's saying that government can create a special present and a special benefit and a special right. It does not say that it can create a special right out of a new disadvantage. Yeah, you see, it is actually hard to define, I guess. So it is a bit harder. I mean, it really, you have to, you do have to read in some level of interpretation. Well, I wouldn't say that. You do, in order to think through this, you have to add some words. I can derive it technically from the mere fact that it uses the word or and not and. That would be one way of doing it, to make sure that I'm not adding to the text. But in order to make it easy to understand, you have to make something of an arbitrary description between arbitrary in that you could define it in many other different ways, possibly. But there is obviously a distinction to be made between an omission, the role that government plays as a mediator, as a point of redress, in delivering a remedy. Yeah, so I'm just trying to find my powers of explaining things simply are not always that good. But basically, in the same way that there is a difference between a conscious omission and a reckless omission, and a conscious commission and an unconscious commission, which would be something like an indirect unintended consequence. Suddenly all these things don't merely become completely interchangeable. Um, and essentially I have basically already sort of, I mean, trying to get, it's such a sort of a common sense thing that I think, sort of, to argue with how I sort of already articulated it at the start is going to be, I mean, combined with how I explained how essentially government has, instead of responsibly orchestrating this responsibility and duty given to it by the Constitution, to actually come up with innovative or intelligent solutions. Instead, it has passed the buck onto the private sector, and instead of saying we will be the bridge to bringing progress by actually having to develop programs that engage people and help bridge the gaps that history, or disadvantaged persons currently sit with, that the defect does not belong to history. The defect exists in the present. And in some sense, there's no point in trying to just give people some kind of general reparation. It needs specific solutions in specific cases. And if there cannot be a specific solution in a specific case, that government can think of a program in order to bridge a gap, then in some definitional sense, the disadvantage no longer exists. Because the disadvantage, at least in the phrasing of Section 9, is not a historical condition. It belongs to persons and actual categories that are made up of disadvantaged persons. The only reason why categories are mentioned is because that is how special measures and legislative policy would create a program as a delivery vehicle towards actually filling a gap and creating a program in which there would be applications made to enter that program to get some extra assistance. This, in some sense, is not it's not a compensation for the unfair discrimination. It is only a compensation for the disadvantage as I have just defined it, i.e. there's something that can be done about it. Unfair discrimination as a historical entity or as a legal sort of property does not, although it might be morally described as anyone may choose to do so, as a legal point of as a legal point of reference, it is only relevant in terms of Section 9, subsection 2, in terms of government's power and special duty to allocate resources, especially to tackling whatever disadvantage it is capable of finding a solution for. And again, these disadvantages actually have to exist in persons fundamentally, and then they are open to application to categories of persons. The idea that the benefit belongs to the category that is an ideological reading of social justice, which does not conform to a non-racialist society. So if you notice in my whole treatment, if you are into identity politics, you would probably at some point call me a white supremacist for going through this line of reasoning, or some stupid refutation or some outrage or something. I'm sure you haven't even gotten this far um, into the recording, but you'll notice uh, how essentially I have been blunt and stark in that um, I have given no uh, moral weight to the notion of identity. In fact, identity, as envisaged by Section 9, subsection 2, is mere, or in as much as you can see that categories of persons might be something akin to an identity in inverted commas. Well, if you would follow the rationale in my logic, you will see that it's merely a means to an end, to actually delivering a very particular solution, which by definition is solved. It solves the disadvantage. In how it's used in the promotion of equality and prevention of unfair discrimination, it's a drop in the ocean that is never enough. And the burden is directly on civil society or private enterprise, or so somehow everyone is tasked with this extraordinary special measure machine, which Section 9 gives only to government, essentially. To protect or advance. And essentially what Parliament then decided to do was to create a morality ideology, sort of mystifying unfair discrimination into a form in which it could be deployed by anyone against anyone on the basis of what is defined in the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act as harassment, which is by its very nature a relativistic and subjective animal, as it's described or as it's defined in the Act. I mean, it's literally the kinds of qualifications, especially also in the hate speech. You notice that there's there isn't. It's strange because it does specifically repeat some elements in the freedom of speech right, but it leaves out the letters which correspond to uh, the dissemination of ideas between, it's one can only describe it as fudged. It's a fudged treatment of the Constitution, for one, which is unforgivable, firstly. And it does this to preserve and validate its own ideological position, which is fundamentally opposed with the Constitution. It has allowed government to abrogate its duty, to be lazy and stay unaccountable for the lack of progress, and to shift that accountability onto civil society according to its ideological schema, in which categories of persons are not, or historically disadvantaged categories of persons are not collectively being promoted to a state of equality. And this has roughly been, so in some sense it's very strange because government has stepped out of its own shoes. It's which has really just strengthened the arguments which actually are black and white in the act itself of structural oppression. I mean, anyway, so I've given some general things. I can give some quotes to back up, how it's in here. With in section 29, which is where the act itself actually gives specific examples of how this would play out in certain um, industries and private matters. Uh, in subsection 8a of section 29, it describes historically disadvantaged groups. That whole notion is just fundamentally, it's racialist in nature. It does not deserve to be secondary legislation in a constitutional context. It's disgusting. Historically disadvantaged groups. So people can receive a special benefit merely because they belong in some kind of arbitrary categorization of other people who were disadvantaged. So if your group was historically disadvantaged, but you are no longer a person with historical disadvantage, but you still belong to the group that was historically disadvantaged, I mean, that's just, it just doesn't make any sense. Um, in subsection 9b, imposing terms, so it says that certain institutions, financial institutions, can't impose, it has a prohibition against imposing terms, conditions, and practices that perpetuate the consequences of past unfair discrimination. How can you how can you burden people in an industry that has to work according to the rule of law and has to create rules and regulations that actually function and that can actually be understood and followed by the people involved, when they can't do anything that is seen as perpetuating the consequences of past unfair discrimination? How could you ever thumbsuck if something perpetuates the I mean, I know something that I mean, like if banks just gave out money to everyone who said that they were part of a historically disadvantaged group, I mean, like, by not having that practice, they are obviously perpetuating the consequences of past unfair discrimination. I mean, imposing terms, conditions, and practice. I mean, so, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean to make as little profit as possible? I mean, like, what? How can that ever be cashed out in any meaningful way? It's I mean, this is the same kind of bullshit that Google's "don't be evil," and in fact, the Google phrase was always "don't be evil." Be being the operative word, not do. They changed it later on to "don't do evil," so that they could justify the evil things that they do, paradoxically. Be is about integrity and character and about knowing and understanding principles. But no, now they have a moral code instead. Just like there's a code now to not impose terms, conditions, and practices that perpetuate the consequences of past unfair discrimination. You can't perpetuate consequences of past unfair discrimination. What does that imply? That implies everything and anything. That doesn't, it's just, it's fudged. I mean, like, you can't not describe that as just, I mean, that's an excuse for anyone to complain about anything at any time, and everyone will think that their moral self-righteousness is not being properly validated by the people listening to their inane and incessant complaining about consequences of past unfair discrimination. That gives anyone, anytime, a soapbox to stand up and shout radical and violent action in the name of opposing consequences of past unfair discrimination. I mean, if you have stuff like that written in secondary legislation, I mean, you might as well have just, as soon, when did this come in? 2004. I mean, you might as well have. Well, actually, I would like to know when this act actually got this bad, because I mean, I'm only reading the latest version of it. So I wonder if it was always this ideologically poisonous, or when they actually confined the South African Constitution into its grave. So, I mean, essentially, this is an armament against anyone to do anything, essentially, because if they can do anything that can be described by anyone as perpetuating consequences of past unfair discrimination, they just have to absorb that complaint. As unfair as it might be, they have to absorb that complaint. And based on anything being described as a consequence of past unfair discrimination, whatever hoops they have to jump through will be seen as a fair form of, whatever double standards that they have to impose on their books, in essentially disintegrating institutional integrity, because we won't have a single law and guidelines and rules, because no, we have to have a separate but equal moral domain based on that broad umbrella that will let anything fly, essentially, in such a vague and nebulous way, in which you have to create two bread line queues now. I haven't gone into the zero sum dimension of this, but sadly, that is where it has to actually reach its equilibrium point. Is that until it actually creates a desperate enough general situation that brings everyone to the same level, in which you can actually then say, oh, well, actually, no, now finally they do have it worse off than us. Now we can actually start to equalize the score. Like it actually has to get to that point. Although once you're on that road of desperation, it will might as well just go for a genocide at that point. I mean, why even have uh, uh, such a minority around? You might as well be done with the white devils. So sadly, these are all extra constitutional qualifications in making discrimination that is fundamentally unconstitutional fair. Section 9 of the Bill of Rights, subsection 2, does not give government the right to decide itself unfair constitution that will be made fair. It gives the right of government to give special budgets to positive programs that assist people, not by suppressing other people. It's not a zero-sum mechanism. It's zero-sum in the fact that other people won't be allowed entry into those special awards, special benefits, those special rights that are being, you see, but those special rights are not allowed to themselves be be made out of, yeah, those benefits awarded exclusively to people disadvantaged by unfair discrimination are not themselves or those special rights themselves are not in their substance made from the unfair discrimination of others as their primary operative force. It's only as an indirect, in some sense, those other people should suffer some indirect sense of unfair discrimination, although it doesn't even make sense to call it. No, it wouldn't be unfair discrimination, because the fair discrimination is that simply that they are not allowed to apply to that same or they're not allowed to receive benefit from the same program of that same special measure. In some sense, it's very clear that it says protect or advance. Is not the same thing. Both are not the same thing as to solve unfair discrimination. That is a moral question capable of endless argument. The moral questions are always open to people to have various opinions, and some people maybe will hold on to, you can't impose questions of forgiveness and reconciliation on some people, nor should a legal system expect people to hold opinions of any particular species. You can have a general cultural movement, but it's not going to be. You can try and have somewhat. A culture will always be an organic thing, fundamentally, controlled by people having interpersonal connections and conversations and communications with each other. So, in protecting or advancing equality, there is no promise to solve unfair discrimination. It can only be protected against equality can only be protected or advanced, but what is actually being solved is specific disadvantages or sets of disadvantages which are contended with through specific plans, not vague and general ideological strategies of promotion, which becomes a medium of exteriorized unaccountability by government onto general society, which is effectively an endless treadmill of excuses and ideological scapegoating. Equality is advanced by definitive solutions, or a definitive solution to a disadvantage, not by the solution of unfairness. So you have the focus on a kind of ideological elaboration of unfairness and using that as a code of conduct, essentially also transforming the common law to having to conform. I mean, you would think that um, you wouldn't need in a common law setting. You shouldn't need a special definition of harassment. You think people don't have a you know, we had much better tools, legal tools of dealing with these things before, much better standards as well than just subjective relative feelings, and creating protected grounds that belong to historically disadvantaged groups, which effectively says that it's the strange kind of reading of law that really has to make judgments on people's intentions and take readings of their thoughts. It actually has to make findings as to the specific form of thinking taking place within the perpetrator's mind. It does a very strange thing in sort of layering a weird kind of, because it's not just like the normal conception of mens rea. It comes with its own very strange baggage of racialist pride being evenly distributed in the mind of the so-called perpetrator. And so, I mean, this lecture, I'm pretty sure, in a very dry technical sense, will contravene harassment. If someone subjects themselves to listening to this lecture, um, I'm pretty sure it falls foul of the definition of harassment within the Act.